A short story, 20 seconds. A story about the moment everything changes. Daniel had exactly 20 seconds to decide whether the man across the platform was going to die, and whether he was the only one who could stop it. The subway smelled like burnt coffee and wet umbrellas. Daniel Chen stood at the edge of Platform 4 at Grand Central, his laptop bag digging into his left shoulder, his mind already 12 floors up in the conference room where he was already 8 minutes late. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A busker somewhere behind him played something slow on a violin. The train was not coming. He checked his watch. The Rolex his father had left him, the one thing worth keeping from a man who hadn't been worth much at all. 8:47 a.m. The Meridian Capital pitch started at 9. $23 million and 2 years of his life were balanced on the next 40 minutes, and he was standing in a tunnel under Manhattan watching a rat investigate a discarded hot dog wrapper. That's when he noticed the man in the gray coat. He was standing near the far end of the platform, past the yellow safety line, too close to the edge for it to be accidental. Daniel noticed the way his shoulders curved inward as if folding around some invisible wound. The man was perhaps 60. Silver-haired, slight, with the kind of stillness that is not peace but its absence. His shoes, Daniel noticed for no reason he could explain, were very clean, freshly polished. The shoes of a man who had prepared for something. Daniel's phone buzzed. Marcus, his co-founder, where are you? Nguyen is asking questions. He looked at the screen, looked back at the man. The man had moved an inch closer to the edge. 20 seconds. That's what the psychology textbooks say is the average window of a suicide attempt at a transit station, the time between a person committing to action and acting. Daniel didn't know this then. He learned it afterward in the strange, hollow weeks that followed, when he found himself reading things he'd never expected to read, filling the silence with facts the way people fill empty rooms with furniture. What he did know in that moment was a feeling, not a thought. A feeling low and certain, like a bass note held underwater. Something is wrong with that man. He put his phone in his pocket. Later, he would struggle to explain why he moved. He wasn't a heroic person, or didn't think of himself as one. He'd grown up careful, methodical, the kid who checked the math twice, who never jumped from the high dive until he'd watched someone else do it first. His therapist, a small woman named Dr. Farida who smelled faintly of cardamom and asked good questions, had once told him that he protected himself by treating feelings like suggestions, not commands. But that morning something rearranged itself. He moved. He walked the length of the platform, past the commuters sealed inside their headphones and their private urgencies. A woman with twins in a double stroller. A teenager photographing his own sneakers. An old man reading a physical newspaper, which felt, in that moment, like something from another world entirely. He stopped beside the man in the gray coat. "Excuse me," Daniel said. The man didn't turn. Up close, he had a long, weathered face, deep-set eyes fixed on some point far beyond the tunnel mouth. His hands hung at his sides, perfectly still. "I'm sorry to bother you," Daniel said, and felt immediately, stupidly inadequate. "I'm sorry to bother you," as if he'd bumped into him in a hallway. I noticed you standing here, and I wanted to ask if you were okay." A long pause, long enough for Daniel to wonder if the man had heard him at all. "I'm fine," the man said. His voice was quiet and very flat. The voice of someone who had been telling that particular lie so long it had worn smooth. "Okay," Daniel said. He didn't move. He wasn't sure why. His body seemed to have made a separate decision from his brain, the way it sometimes does when instinct is smarter than intellect. "My name's Daniel. I'm supposed to be somewhere important right now, and I'm standing here instead, so." He paused. "I thought maybe you might want some company for a minute." The man's name was Robert Lane. He was 61 years old. He had been a high school history teacher in Queens for 32 years, and 6 months ago he had retired, and in the retirement he had discovered that a very large part of what he believed to be himself had, apparently, been the job. Without it, he told Daniel slowly, haltingly, standing on the platform as the trains came and went and came again. He had felt himself grow lighter and lighter in a way that was not freedom but erasure. His wife had noticed. His 2 adult children had not. He had been trying to decide for 3 weeks whether the absence he felt was temporary, a transition, a tunnel with a far end, or permanent. This morning he had woken up and decided it was permanent. He had polished his shoes, which was a thing he did when he wanted to feel in control of something. He had taken the subway to Grand Central, out of a habit so deep it had become instinct. And he had stood on the platform and thought, 1 step. "And then you talked to me," Robert said. There was a faint note of wonder in it, as if he himself couldn't quite account for what had happened. Daniel didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He had learned, recently and imperfectly, that silence could be a form of presence. They sat down on a bench together. Daniel had suggested it, gently steering them back from the edge by a technique he could not have described, but that involved simply beginning to move and trusting that Robert would follow. He had. They sat, and the trains came and went, and Daniel called Marcus and said he wasn't coming and listened to 30 seconds of panic before hanging up. He'd deal with that later. He didn't know how. He'd deal with it later. "I don't want to die," Robert said after a while. His voice had changed. Something had come back into it. "I want to feel like it matters that I'm here. That's a different thing, isn't it?" "Yes," Daniel said. "That's completely different." Daniel stayed with Robert Lane for 2 hours. He called Robert's wife, Patricia, from a contact Robert found in his own phone with shaking hands. Patricia arrived 22 minutes later. She was a small woman with quick brown eyes, and she said Robert's name in a voice that contained everything: terror and love and relief, and the particular anguish of someone who had been afraid and hadn't known quite how afraid until this moment. She held her husband on the platform and cried without trying to hide it, and Daniel stood a few feet away and looked at his shoes, which were, by comparison, quite scuffed. Robert shook Daniel's hand before he left. His grip was steadier than Daniel expected. "You made me feel like I existed." Robert said, "That's what you did. You made me feel visible." Daniel nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak well. He walked out of Grand Central into the bright, indifferent morning and called Marcus back. The Meridian pitch had collapsed. Nguyen had left at 9:30, irritated and final. 2 years, 23 million, gone. "I'm sorry," Marcus said with real feeling. "Where were you?" Daniel stood on the sidewalk outside the terminal, watching cabs and the ceaseless river of strangers. "I was somewhere I needed to be," he said. He grieved the pitch. He'd be dishonest if he didn't acknowledge that, lying in bed that night staring at the ceiling, running the numbers, the timelines, the what-ifs. There were bad weeks ahead. Restructuring. Difficult conversations. Marcus was angry, then understanding, then complicated in the way that real friends become when something true and inconvenient happens between them. But something else happened too, quieter and more durable. Daniel started to look at the platforms. Not obsessively. Not in the way of someone who has turned a single experience into a vocation or a pathology, but with attention. With the specific quality of attention that comes from knowing that sometimes the most important thing in a room is not the thing demanding your focus, but the thing asking for nothing at all, the quiet person at the edge, the shoulders turned inward, the clean shoes. He started talking to people more. Unremarkable conversations mostly. A woman in a coffee shop who looked like she'd been crying. An old man confused by a subway map. A teenager sitting alone outside a school looking at nothing. Sometimes nothing was wrong and they thought he was strange, and that was fine. Sometimes something was a little wrong and the small kindness of being noticed made it a little less wrong, and that was better. Once and only once, something was very wrong, and he stayed, and it mattered. And afterward he sat in his car in a parking lot for a long time and let himself shake. He never met Robert Lane again. But 6 months after the platform, an envelope arrived at his office. No return address, neat handwriting, a Queen's postmark. Inside was a single index card. On it, in careful script, I started volunteering at the library. They have a Tuesday morning reading program for kids. I read to them from history books. Did you know children love history if you tell it right? It turns out I like Tuesdays very much. Thank you for giving me more of them. RL. Daniel kept the card. He put it in the inner pocket of his laptop bag next to his father's Rolex. He wasn't sure for a while why those two objects felt right together. Then one afternoon on a delayed train, sitting, not rushing, watching, he understood. The watch was a reminder of time squandered. The card was a reminder of time given back. He had been on a platform with 20 seconds and he had decided without deciding that those seconds belonged to someone else. He had never once regretted it, not the pitch, not the money, not any of it. What he had learned, and he turned it over in his mind the way you turn a river stone, finding it smoother every time, was this: attention is the first form of love. Before words, before action, before anything. To look at a person and let your eyes say plainly, I see you. You are here. You are real. That is where it starts. That is where everything starts. He had done nothing extraordinary on that platform. He had simply looked up from his phone. It was, he would come to believe, the most important thing he'd ever done.